part 2 of chapter 27, basically an overview of the 19th century. We spent last time talking about the art of the two main sort of movements that dominated the early 19th century, which is neoclassicism, which, as you guys know, began actually in the previous century during the sort of as an offshoot of the Enlightenment and this age of revolution. And then we also see the other movement of Romanticism. And these two styles of art dominate France and really the rest of Europe and a big chunk of the Western world throughout the first half of the 19th century. Both of these styles are very different from each other, but what they had in common is they're both rather unrealistic. They don't really care about showing how things really are, and even when they depict real-life events, oftentimes they depict that in a very sort of dramatic, unrealistic sort of way. And both of these styles are kind of the major styles, the sort of accepted styles of the art academies. Now, this is something I've mentioned a little bit already, but I want to talk a lot more about the art academies because in the 19th century we're going to see their effect and impact on art, but also the ultimate rejection of these institutions. Now, the Royal Academy of Painting had been around since the time of Louis XIV, our good old buddy, the Sun King in France. And it originally started as a way of sort of controlling the commerce of paintings and ensuring that artists were creating quality works and that art dealers were selling quality works. But eventually what happens is the Art Academy, the Royal Academy of Painting, becomes sort of like this big government agency that oversees really the production of art. And every year the Academy held what was called the Grand Salon. By the 1800s, this is being held at the Louvre in Paris, but early salons were held at Versailles. But this was basically a way for artists to show their works for a mass audience, and there were prizes, there were awards, and it could really make or break an artist's career. But there were very sort of strict rules about what could be accepted and what could not be accepted. And this is important, guys, because there was sort of a hierarchy of what was considered great art. And the sort of at the top of this pyramid, if you will, were history paintings. And this includes historical subjects, biblical subjects, mythological subjects. So, for example, things like the Raft of the Medusa, would have been perfect. Or, biblical scenes, that kinds of stuff, Greek mythology. And these were typically large-scale paintings. We're talking, 10, 15-foot paintings sometimes. These were like the big budget Hollywood blockbusters of their day. These are like the Michael Bays and the Steven Spielbergs and whatnot, the Marvel movies, if you will, of their time. And then there was sort of a smaller, less important categories. And you can see over here we have, portraits, genre paintings, which you guys know that term, paintings of everyday life, landscapes, still life paintings, paintings of animals, and there was like all sorts of other things underneath that. And those who were the big history painters were the most respected artists. There were a lot of other rules with the academies. Women were not allowed into the Academy of Painting. They were before the French Revolution, but after the French Revolution, they were not for a while. It was highly competitive. Artists, their career could be made or broken, whether they were allowed into the salon. But also what the salon did was it sort of limited what artists could do. In terms of subject matter, in terms of style. If you didn't paint in these sort of two broad categories, Romanticism or Neoclassicism, or if you didn't paint kinds of subject matter that was sort of accepted in the official list, then you were excluded. So this meant there's no room for experimentation, there's no room for new ideas, there's no room for really anything that goes against sort of the status quo, the standards that have been set by the Academy. And people are starting to find this more and more and more limiting. And they're starting to be butting up against the rules of the Academy. And the thing is, these art academies were copied all over Europe, as I had said before. So, you know, the threats against the sort of dissatisfaction with the French Academy was also reflected in against other academies across Europe. And that brings us to a movement we call realism, which is a movement that in many ways was designed to reject and oppose the sort of strict parameters and stipulations put down by the French Royal Academy of Painting. And realism is like Romanticism is also an offshoot in many ways of a literary movement. In realist literature in French, you had authors like Balzac and Gustave Flaubert, who created these novels that were very real, that were about everyday life, that were about normal everyday people, and going through sort of the trials and tribulations of modern day society. These weren't about great heroes, these weren't about big historical or biblical events, but these were about modern day people living modern day lives, and they were written in a very sort of almost plain kind of way. And this is starting to become a very influential literature. They offered, you know, like you can see over here, images of working life, nightlife, sort of gritty subject matter. Okay. There's also some other things going on at this time. As industrialization is starting to grow and grow and grow, workers in factories and in the cities are starting to sort of butt up against the long hours, the poor pay, and just the sort of general poor treatment by large companies and manufacturers. And this is not only happening in sort of urban environments associated with industry and large-scale manufacturing, but it's also happening in rural areas with farmhands and peasants and people who have more rural occupations. And this is eventually going to lead to a series of sort of small skirmishes and a small revolution in 1848, which saw a revolution of working class people against sort of elite classes. And a lot of this is also spurred on by the rise of the writings of Karl Marx, and this concept of socialism and concepts of communism, which are saying that workers should have the means of production, that workers are the most important part of society, not those who run the companies, but those who work for the companies are the ones who are most important. And this is sort of invigorating a lot of working class people across Europe and really across the world. Okay, so this is a painting called The Stonebreakers, and it is by a guy named Gustave Courbet, who is sort of the granddaddy of realism, even though he would say, you know, that's a word that you guys sort of invented, but it's not, I'm just a painter. But he's actually a guy who's really behind this sort of doctrine of realism, that art should be about real people, it should be about everyday things. Very famously, Courbet was asked by a critic, why don't you paint angels? And he very famously responded with, show me an angel and I'll paint you one. So what the guy is really asking is, why don't you paint these history scenes? Why don't you paint these big historical events and stuff like that? And basically Courbet is saying, because it doesn't matter, man. What matters is the struggles of everyday people right here and now in this world. I don't care about what happened 200 years ago, or I don't care about Greek mythology. Those aren't relevant. What's relevant are the struggles of everyday people. For Courbet, he is kind of a man on a mission. He grew up in in the French countryside. He grew up among the working class and the peasants and the field hands that he often painted. Although he is from, sort of the upper middle class of French society, he saw the struggles of these people firsthand, and he felt like he's really kind of on a mission to represent these people in art. So this is a painting called The Stonebreakers. We no longer have it. It was destroyed. It was in Germany, in Dresden during World War II. And if you know anything about the history of World War II, Dresden was firebombed by Allied forces and more or less leveled. And unfortunately, we lost a lot of art, including this very, very famous image. So this is a color photograph that was taken before it was destroyed in 1945. So it was only, it only survived. It was less than 100 years in existence. It's just sort of remarkable when you think of it that way. So when this debuted, it was sort of seen in horror. There was a very negative reaction to this painting. Because what Courbet has done is he's painted on a rather large scale. This is an 8-foot painting, a scale of art that is normally reserved for these big history paintings. He's painted two normal people, two working class people, an old man and a young, basically a boy, and doing very unheroic things. They are breaking rocks. They are taking big stones and smashing them into smaller stones for construction and building. And for Courbet, these are segments of society that are often ignored or looked down upon. In fact, the way he's painted them, they're faceless. Their backs are turned to us, and they are like an unknown portion of society, ignored and not even thought about by many people. And for Courbet, he's blown them up on a heroic scale, because for Courbet, these are the people who really make societies function, those who do the menial task that nobody else wants to do. And these are the people who need paintings, large-scale paintings made about them. And so for Courbet, he's kind of heroicizing at the same time, lamenting our ignorance and our lack of concern for these people who struggle so hard to make kind of the world work. You can also see that he's commenting on the way they're treated by society by the way he's depicted their clothing, which are these torn old rags, and by their sort of meager lunch over here. So he's really kind of doing everything that is against the rules of the Academy in terms of subject matter. He's taken something normal and mundane and everyday. He's taken people who aren't important and he's heroicized them. But also look at the way he's painting. Courbet is painted in a very sort of ugly style. He used grays and muddy colors to depict sort of the reality of the world. He also painted in a very unfinished, unrefined, kind of gritty style. If you look down here at the ground, you can see it's sort of lumpy and almost unfinished looking. Courbet used a device called a palette knife, which is basically a thin trowel. And it's like frosting a cake. You take the oil paint and you kind of smear it on the surface, creating a thick surface. That's called an impasto. Impasto is when you have sort of this raised, textured surface made out of paint down here. It comes from the Italian word meaning paste. So we have, in many ways, sort of the anti-academic painting. We have something that is ugly where academic painting should be beautiful. We have something that's unrefined when it should be refined. We have everyday poor people being depicted as heroes. This is considered by many to be Courbet's masterpiece. It's called the Burial at Ornans. And Ornans is the town in rural France where Courbet is from. And it is kind of a depiction, first of all, it's a depiction of a funeral, but not sort of the grand funerals we're used to seeing. This isn't the death of a pope or a saint or some important ruler, but this is just an ordinary dude. And he's painted it on a grand scale, which is his want, right? Is to take normal everyday lives and blow them up for the big screen to celebrate than the normal everyday people. And so this is a almost 23-foot painting. And in this painting we have sort of a rather remarkable, I'm going to move my little image over here, image that is, once again, kind of ugly with its use of the palette knife and these sort of dreary kinds of colors. But also look at the way he's painted the people. These aren't perfect, beautiful looking people, but these are people of the working classes and the peasant classes. And look at the way he's depicting the priest here in the middle, or the bishops, I should say, in the middle, with their large noses and their sort of red complexion, implying maybe a propensity for drinking too much. There's a real sort of criticism of those in power and those elite classes here. And then also he's dealing with sort of the grim reality of death. We have this open grave right at the lip of the painting, where almost we feel like as a viewer we could sort of lean over and peer in. He's not sort of glossing over the fact that we're all going to end up in a hole in the ground. And to make sort of matters even less kind of noble, he's put this dog, just this random dog who's kind of wandered in from the countryside, standing at the, just kind of crashing, if you will, this funeral. He's taken all the kind of almost glamour that is often portrayed in death, this sort of reverential kind of glamour that we often see, and he's stripped it away to its reality. And so that's what really realism is, guys. Realism doesn't mean the paintings are going to look super realistic. Realism is about the real life in a real way, right? This is not reality television. This is not scripted. This is reality, right? So Courbet, pardon me, was, like many artists, excited about something called the Exposition Universelle, the Universal Exposition, which was a huge, basically like a trades fair and a world's fair and a technological fair, all wrapped up into one. That was the big talk of the town in Paris in 1855. And as you can imagine, the Grand Salon that year was going to be a really big deal, because millions of people from not just France, but from all over the world were going to be coming to this exposition. And France is already this sort of cultural center of Europe anyway, with French painters being kind of the top artist in Europe. And so everybody's going to come and want to see the Grand Salon. This is a big deal. And even Courbet, who often didn't like the practices of the Academy, understood that if his art is shown here, he's going to get a certain kind of recognition he wouldn't have otherwise. But some of his paintings were rejected. It says over here 3 out of 14. I have read other scholars say 7 out of 14 of his paintings that he submitted were rejected. So I really don't know what to tell you. I need to research this a little bit further. But this is a massive, once again, this is, a 20-some-odd foot painting. It's huge. And this is a painting called The Artist's Studio, a real allegory of a 7-year phase in my artistic and moral life. And this was painted for something Courbet called the Pavilion of Realism. What happens was this. After some of his paintings were rejected from the Grand Salon, Courbet basically said, screw it. I'm not going to deal with the Academy anymore. I am sick of them dominating art. I am sick of their rules. I am sick of their limitations. I'm just going to do things my own way. So he rents a building across the street from the Grand Salon, and he fills it with his own paintings, and he calls it the Pavilion of Realism. Now, initially, it's not much of a success. But over time, more and more people during this big exposition start to come and visit. And even more importantly, after it shuts down in Paris, he takes it on a tour. And in the Pavilion of Realism, basically Courbet is saying, look, I don't need the Academy. I can become successful without it. And this gamble pays off. It works. And so what Courbet does then is he kind of changes the rules of the game. He's now shown that you don't need the Academy anymore if you want to be a successful artist. You don't have to play by their rules. And so what Courbet does here is in this painting is he's sort of showing us that he is a painter with a mission. This is an allegory. So let me move myself out of the way here. Hey, I'm over here now. This is an allegory, meaning it's a symbolic story. And Courbet has centered himself in the middle. A man doing what he feels God put him on earth to do, which is paint, which is to observe the world and paint it. And that is what he's doing here, being shown in front of this landscape painting. Now, over here on the left are sort of the working class and peasant class and field hands and farmers of the world that Courbet comes from. Over on the right are images of the movers and shakers of the Parisian art world. So these are various other artists and art dealers and patrons and important people. And Courbet has placed him in the center of both of these worlds because he's a man who lives in the world of art but comes from this world of everyday people. And you'll notice around him is a boy and a nude model. The nude model represents beauty, and the boy represents innocence. And so basically what Courbet is saying is, I'm looking at the world in a new way, with an innocent eye, with a fresh eye, to portray the truth and the beauty of this world. In other words, I'm taking the world of these working class people and showing it to the world, the art world. And so what Courbet is really saying here is like, I'm a person with a purpose, and I'm going to do what I want. And what I think is important, and what I think is best and moral, and all this other stuff. And if you don't like it, well, that's your problem, buddy. And if it means I'm not as successful as I could be, if I had done what the Academy wanted to be, well, that's okay too. I'm willing to take that risk. So what Courbet sort of represents as kind of a new artist is really a modern artist, because in many ways he sort of represents this idea of modern art, which is that artists must constantly innovate. Artists must constantly reject what came before. And artists must constantly present new ways of looking at the world. And even if this means that their careers aren't as successful, or that they suffer for this individuality and this need to express themselves the way they want to express themselves, then so be it. They're not going to be dictated to by the church or the government or by an academy or by any of these other institutions. They're going to do what they want, because as an artist, that is their sort of moral obligation. But this idea of sort of expressing yourself, this idea of looking for things that are new, this is a really big part of what modern art will be. And Courbet really sort of begins this here in the 1840s and the 1850s. Now, for my viewers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, if you want to see a Courbet, you can see one of my favorite Courbets at the Dallas Museum of Art. It is called Fox in the Snow. And Courbet didn't just paint images of working class people and their struggles. He also painted a lot of images of wildlife and, images of hunters and hunting, but also just images of nature doing what nature does in his own brutally kind of realistic sort of way. So in this painting, we see this fox in this sort of bleak, snowy landscape. And it has hunted down, and it is now eating this field mouse. So this is not the Walt Disney view of nature, but this is a realistic view of nature. It's a tough world out there. We have to struggle to survive. Those that are weaker and smaller often get devoured by those who are more powerful. Nice little allegory there, Courbet, right? He's also using this really rough, textured surface created with a palette knife. And I can't wait for you guys to go to the Dallas Museum of Art and to see this. And you can stand up close to it and you can see the texture. You can see the impasto sitting on top of the surface of the image. It's really cool. So there were lots of different artists influenced by Courbet and this concept of realism. There was a whole group of artists who called themselves the Barbizon School. Barbizon is a village in the Fontainebleau forest in France, and it is these artists, and especially their primary artist, Jean-Francois Millet, were like Courbet, interested in working class people. This is an image called the Gleaners, and these are peasants who were allowed by some farmers, after the wheat or whatever grain it was that was harvested, were allowed to come in after the threshers sort of plowed up everything. They were allowed to come and pick and glean whatever remnants of grain they could off the ground. And they made their living, with this sort of back-breaking labor, these sort of poor people living off the sort of scraps of those in control. Paintings like this weren't often accepted gladly by the upper classes. Many of them who, the middle and upper classes, many of them who owned land and looked down upon people like these women who were gleaning their property. I want you guys to, I'm going to post a video below about lithography, which is a printmaking process. So I want you to watch that video because I'm not going to talk about it here because the video does a much better job of showing it. So you'll watch the lithography video, and now we're going to talk about a lithograph by an artist named Honoré Daumier. Daumier is another realist who primarily worked for newspapers and sort of left-leaning French periodicals and magazines. And he was often focused on the social injustices of the world, in France in particular. And this is a horrific image created in this new lithographic process of basically a police massacre. In France, there was a group of housing projects, basically, and a sniper shot at a group of police. And the police, in their quest to find this sniper, went into this apartment block and basically killed dozens of people, men, women, and children, in this horrific display of violence. And that is what is depicted here. We see this dead body of a woman and her husband, and you can see that he is lying on top of a child who he is looks like he has been trying to protect. So realism could be really rather gruesome, because realism is in many ways art with a social conscience, right? It is art that is trying to demonstrate the inequalities of the world, and especially the inequalities of the modern world, as some people gain more and more power and wealth and control of this new sort of technologically based, industrially based economies. A lot of other people end up being sort of crushed under the weight and the power of those people. So Daumier is very much interested in the struggles of the working class and the poor. Like in this painting of the third class carriage, where he is meant to show certain the inequality and the French transportation system, where if you were in the first or second class carriages, you would have your own sort of compartments. But if you were in the third class carriage, you couldn't afford to go in the first class. You were sort of crammed in on these uncomfortable benches in these rather unsanitary, cramped conditions. So certainly life for the working class in Paris and in many places around the world at this time was pretty miserable. And artists like Courbet and Millet and Daumier really felt they were on kind of a mission from God, really, to expose these inequalities. Now, sometimes realism took a different approach. This is the artist Rosa Bonheur. And if you want to see some Rosa Bonheur, there are several of these of her work in the Dallas Museum of Art. And rather focusing sort of on the injustices of the world, like some of Courbet's work, she was fascinated by animals and people's relationship to animals. She often painted everything from cows in a field to horse shows. But being a woman, she was often kept away from these places, even though she was a gold medal winner of the Salon in 1848, which was extremely rare for a woman to do. She still suffered a lot of inequalities, and so she took to dressing as a man to not draw attention to herself, and because of the fact that she was a respected artist, she was given a little more latitude than a lot of other women at this time. Rosa Bonheur was also a lesbian, so she very much kind of brought this outsider's view to a world that was often dominated by men. Things like, fairs and horse shows and a lot of farm labor was often male-dominated, and she was really she was a woman who could sort of give her unique and beautiful perspective to this. She often said that she preferred animals over men. And I think that love of animals shows. I will be honest with you. She's maybe my favorite animal painter. I think her depiction of horses is absolutely beautiful. She understood not only the anatomy of horses, but I think their demeanor and their movements and their personalities better. And I think in some ways that she paints animals with more personality than she did people. She was very much an animal lover. She loved all kinds of animals, even exotic animals. At one point, she actually even owned some lions. So she's this rather eccentric. She's kind of this eccentric figure, if you could imagine, this sort of woman in the middle of the 1800s, walking around wearing men's clothing, painting, which in itself would have been rare, sort of openly kind of showing disdain for people and her preference over animals. She's rather this kind of cool, eccentric figure, and also I think one of the great artists of the realist period. Realism is a movement that sort of encompassed a lot of different kinds of subject matter, because if the goal is to paint real life, well, that's a really broad sort of category, isn't it? But nobody kind of pushed the boundaries of what realism is, and really what art could be, than Edouard Manet. Edouard Manet is... Give me just a second. Edouard Manet is an artist who really pushed the boundaries of realism and art in general. In fact, a lot of his paintings were generally rejected from the Grand Salon. But by the time we get to the 1860s, there had become such an interest in art that was not your sort of typical, what we call academic art that was accepted by the academies, that the ruler of France started a second salon called the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Refused, where all of the rejected works could be seen. Now, a lot of these works were not good, and they were kind of openly mocked by the public in general, but some of these works were works that just did not fit into the categories and the rules and the regulations of the French Academy of Painting. And some of them, like this painting, have proven to be some of the most important and influential works of art ever created. This painting was greeted with scandal when it was first presented in 1863. So let's talk about why. This is a painting by Edouard Manet, who was a friend of Courbet, who was a man who was born into some wealth, and who depicted the oftentimes, sometimes less glamorous sides of French life, like many of the realists did, although he was more of an urban painter, where many of these painters are focusing on sort of the struggles of those in the rural areas. Manet is very much looking at the city and urban environments. But this painting isn't kind of a typical realist painting. It's not about sort of the struggles and the inequalities and injustices of the world and working class people, but rather it's a painting about social norms and social mores and social rules. It is a painting about sensuality and sexuality. It is a painting about relationships between men and women and the sort of power dynamics between them. And it is about our idea of what is considered proper and improper. And it is a painting about our hypocrisy and attitudes towards sex. This is heavy stuff. So what is it? What is going on here? How can the painting that seems, and let's admit it, by today's standards, rather tame, cause such a scandal? Okay. So we're looking at a painting of four figures in a public area, and basically kind of a park. One of the figures here is Manet's brother, and the model here in the front is named Victorine Moreau, who was Manet's favorite model at the time. Now, what most people were upset with is her attitude and the nudity of the figure here. So what Manet is doing is he's actually drawn from two other works. One is a painting by Titian, sometimes called Pastoral Symphony, and the other is a print by a guy named Raimondi, who based on an artwork by Raphael. So, two Renaissance works of art, both involving nudity, both involving men and women sort of nude in public, and both considered to be masterpieces. Both works of art would not have been considered to be vulgar or scandalous or anything like that. And you can see how Manet has modeled the general setting off of Titian's work, and he's posed the three main figures in a pretty much a similar way as Raimondi and Raphael did. Now, the Raimondi and Raphael images of Greek mythology, and Titian's work is kind of a sort of fantastic fantasy kind of scene of this sort of perfect, beautiful kind of place. But what made Manet's take on this so scandalous is that this isn't set in some ancient Greek mythological setting or some Renaissance sort of dreamlike landscape, but this is set in the modern day world, here and now. And these aren't some, ancient people or gods or goddesses, but these are regular people, and one of them is a modern day woman sitting stark naked in the middle of a field and really not caring about it. Not ashamed, nothing, just sitting there, and what she's doing is even more unnerving. She is looking at us. She is staring us down, as if she knows what we are looking at. Whereas in many paintings of the past of the nude figure, we either see the woman look sort of demurely or seductively at us, or look away, as if inviting us to look upon her. But for Manet, this nude is confronting us. She is staring us in the eye. Because Victorine was also a woman who was thought to be a prostitute, and a woman who knows what men desire and what men like. And she is basically acknowledging that she knows what we are really wanting to look at. Because this is what Manet is doing. He's saying, look, we have this entire history of the nude figure in art. And the nude figure is there for the male's eyes to look upon as an object of desire. So they either look back at us seductively or they look away and let us look. And Manet is saying, look, the reason why we have all these nudes in art is not because they actually represent something beautiful or something that is, you know, some sort of deeper emotional or intellectual truth, or that they are personifications of liberty or love, or they represent the goddess Venus or whoever. No, the reason why we have this whole history of nude bodies in art, both male and female to be fair, is because we like looking at nude bodies in art. And we can call them what we want. We can say, no, nudes are these beautiful sort of expression of the human soul, and Manet's going, yeah, whatever, dude. You like looking at naked people because you like looking at naked people. And she knows it. And she's calling us out on it. And people do not like to be confronted with this sort of acknowledgement of our own sort of desires. So that's the realism here, isn't it? Him, in many ways, calling the entire history of art and people who view nudes in art a bunch of hypocrites. Yeah, this didn't go down well, did it? Also, you'll notice in the background the figure of the woman back here. If you look closely, you'll notice she's actually too large. She's way too big for the background. If you put her in this boat would sink. She's like twice the size that she should be. Why? Because Manet is rejecting one of the ground rules of art that has been there since the Renaissance, which is the rules of linear perspective. That says that there's this mathematical formula about how big objects are supposed to be the further they are in the background. And he's broken that rule. Why? Because he wants to. Because he doesn't care. Because he knows that woman should be about half her size, but he doesn't care because he wants us to see her better. It makes a better picture. It makes a better composition. And that's what's real. Right? Manet is doing something really strange here besides challenging our own hypocrisy and notions of sexuality. He's also challenging our whole idea of what a painting should be. And in the ever since the Renaissance, painting should primarily be a realistic representation of the world, and Manet is saying, no, it shouldn't. Because if we want to get real, paintings are just paint. They're just paint on a canvas. And this three-dimensional scene that we see is not three-dimensional because painting is actually flat. And these rules that we use to make painting look not flat are just rules that can be broken. Everything that we see in a painting is a lie, and I'm going to expose that lie. He also does it in the way he applies the paint. Look at the grass. This grass is terrible. It doesn't look like grass. It looks like paint smeared on a canvas because it is paint smeared on a canvas. Manet is doing something that is going to have a huge effect on art for the rest, well, up until modern times. And this is a concept called truth to materials. And it begins a little with Courbet using that rough palette knife. But basically Manet is saying, look, paint should look like paint. Canvas should look like canvas. Let's emphasize the nature of those materials. Let's not pretend that that green paint is grass, right? Or the paintings aren't flat. Let's emphasize this sort of the materials that art is made from. So where is all this coming from? Where is all of a sudden this need to sort of reject realistic looking art? Well, a lot of it comes from the invention of photography. Because for a lot of artists, cameras are doing what artists used to be hired to do, which was to create and capture reality. Well, cameras can do that now in an instant. So artists don't have to do that anymore. So artists start kind of messing with the form of painting and sculpture and the other arts. Because now they don't have to worry about painting things 100% realistically, because cameras can do that for you. This is Manet's Olympia, which surprisingly enough was not rejected from the Grand Salon. But it caused as much, if not more, controversy than Luncheon on the Grass, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, did. Olympia is another common name for a prostitute in France, and this is another image of Victorine. And I want you to look at how he paints her. Look how flat she looks. He's gone is that sort of Renaissance chiaroscuro or that Baroque tenebrism to create this feeling of three-dimensional bodies, but instead we're seeing a kind of flat, almost paper doll cutout of a person, emphasizing the falseness, the fakeness of a painting. He's also, once again, having a figure that normally used to look away or look at us seductively can look at us in a confrontational way. Because this is a woman who is absolutely aware of what she does for a living, and she is not ashamed of it. She is a prostitute, and she is quite proud of that fact. And in fact, she understands that she actually benefits from the fact that men like to look at her. And that is represented here in this image of the flowers. This is obviously a man, a customer of hers, who is paying tribute to her by flowers. So he's taken this idea of idealized beauty, the idea of the Greek goddess, which is a subject for lots of art, like, oh, I don't know, the Venus of Urbino. Look familiar? I mean, Manet is definitely, he is taking on the biggies. He's taking on Raphael and Titian, right? As a way of kind of challenging the rules and the history of art itself. And he's saying, look, we can call these women goddesses, and we can say we're looking at them because there's some sort of truth or beauty to be found in the human form. Or we can just admit we like looking at naked people. It's our call. Just keeping it real, right? People were also upset not only they felt the grotesque way it was painted, the sort of unfinished quality of the painting, but some people were actually offended that he put a woman of African descent in such a prominent role in this painting. So Manet is kind of challenging all the kinds of rules of society in one work. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that in the 1860s, 50s, and 60s, that all art is realism. Academic style, neoclassicism, and romanticism still exist. And paintings like this by the artist, for example, Bouguereau, are still really popular. Scenes painted in a very sort of realistic, naturalistic, Renaissance sort of way. Images of classical mythology like this, with very traditional depictions of the nude figure who aren't challenging and confronting us, were still extremely common, and still the majority of the art being produced in France. But this more sort of modern style is starting to become really important. And I want to go back because there's a word I forgot to mention. And this word is key. The word is avant-garde. Avant-garde is a French military term that means the forward guard. These are the people on the front line. These are the people who are in the most dangerous position. But they're also the ones who are blazing the trail and discovering new territory first. And so this is a term that starts to be used in the art world to describe art and music and really any sort of artistic endeavor that pushes boundaries, that is meant to challenge the norms of society, that is meant to challenge the norms of an art form, and to blaze trails into new territories. And this term avant-garde becomes sort of synonymous with modern art. The idea that you're not doing it right unless you're challenging tradition, that you're not doing it right unless you are doing something that nobody else has ever done before. And if you think about it, this is a very modern concept, because a big part of modernism, not just art, but modern society, is that we must innovate. We must constantly be coming up with new things, all right? New technologies. You know, every year we have Apple announce a new iPhone, right? We're not supposed to sit still. We're not supposed to look back, but we're always supposed to look forward and innovate. And this is a modern concept that definitely finds itself in modern art in the form of the avant-garde. Now, realism spreads throughout the world, the Western world. We can see examples of American realists. This is the great artist Winslow Homer, who fought in the Civil War on the side of the Union, and then and also served as an illustrator for some army publications and newspapers. And when he comes back from the war, he painted images that showed Americans working. Because for him, it's like, all right, the war is over. This horrible, terrible divide between the peoples of the United States. And as horrible as it was, we now need to put it past us. And we need to get back to work. And we need to get back to doing what this nation does best, which is working, which is improving our own lives. And so images like this, while also beautiful and sort of quaint and showing this guy out in the field cutting down and harvesting grain, is also meant to sort of show this new attitude in American society that we need to be productive, and we need to put the past behind us, and we need to move ahead. You can see this sort of rough, unfinished style that is very much an influence of Courbet. You can see it especially in the rather sketchy way he has painted the wheat here. Another great American realist is an artist named Thomas Eakins. Thomas Eakins is an artist who's not only influenced by realism, but also by the Dutch Baroque, which in many ways is sort of realism before realism, isn't it? Those paintings were about everyday life, although painted in a rather dramatic way. And you can certainly see the influence of artists like Rembrandt in Eakins' work. Eakins was from Pennsylvania. He taught at the at Penn Academy. He was actually fired for using the nude figure because he believed artists needed to learn from painting the nude figure. But this is a painting called The Gross Clinic, about a doctor named Gross, not because we're looking at surgery and that's gross, although that is gross. That's not why this is called The Gross Clinic. But also, this should ring some bells in some of your head. This looks a lot like Rembrandt's Dr. Tulp's class, doesn't it? So realism, doesn't come out of nowhere. It seemed really new and brash and modern, but there's certainly antecedents. There's certainly things that planted the seeds for realism, and the art of the Dutch Baroque is a big part of that. Another American realist is a guy named Henry Osawa Tanner, an African-American artist who worked primarily in France because of restrictions against African-Americans in his own country. He studied under Eakins, and in fact, Eakins got in some trouble because he allowed Henry Osawa Tanner to become a student of his, and the school wasn't too happy about this. But you can see the influence of Courbet. When Osawa Tanner went to Paris and saw Courbet, he was blown away by not only the subject matter of him depicting sort of the struggles of working class everyday people, but also by this sort of rough, sort of, inelegant kind of style, which is often very synonymous with realism. And I would say Osawa Tanner really pushes sort of the extremes in terms of the experimentalism. His art utilizes sort of this texture and this really dramatic, exciting brushstroke, which I almost I feel like it's really unlike anything that had ever been really seen before this point in history. And I think he's one of the great underrated painters, and probably my favorite American realist, and my second favorite realist next to Courbet. Can you guys tell that I haven't been talking to actual people? For those of you in the future, I am recording this at the time of the big COVID-19 lockdown, and I've been spending most of my days staring into a camera just talking, and I'm going a little nuts, so if I seem a little rambly, that is why. All right, back to our regular scheduled programming. So the 1800s, though, the mid-1800s aren't just all realism. There's other movements. Because what is starting to happen is, now that the academies are losing their control and hold over the art world, we are starting to see lots of different movements start to crop up. And we're going to see lots of artists who have their own idea of what art should be and what their art should look like. And while some artists in this modern era are starting to look towards the future, some are starting to look back at the past, because the future is scary. The future is often ugly and unfair. And there is this real desire to look backwards at what is perceived as a simpler time. Of course, we always see the past as a simpler time, even though it's just as complicated as the present day. And one of those movements comes out of England, and it's called the PreRaphaelite Brotherhood. The term Pre-Raphaelite meant that these artists were interested in art and subject matter from Raphael and before. So from the Renaissance and before, but a lot of art made after that, Mannerism and the Baroque and the Rococo, and they felt was ugly. They felt that it sort of it lacked a certain kind of pure beauty that can be seen in the art of the Renaissance and even before in the Middle Ages. But not only are they interested in the art of the period, they're interested in subject matter of this period and before. Their interests are in things like Shakespeare and stories of King Arthur. They're interested in the writings of the great Italian poet Dante Alighieri and his Divine Comedy. And of course, they're interested in Greek and Roman mythology, but also the mythology of England and the fairy stories of England itself. Among a lot of these people looking back, and the Pre-Raphaelites in England are one of these many, there's various artist groups around Europe at this time who are all kind of painting with a kind of a nostalgia, and who are starting to look backwards at these simpler times. But also, there's a kind of a growing nationalism in Europe at this time, as the modern world is getting sort of larger, and borders are becoming more nebulous, as nations are sort of expanding and contracting and are being connected by things like railroads and stuff like that. And there's a real sense that national identity is being lost. And a lot of artists and writers are sort of looking back at a time where to the roots, or what they see as the roots of their national identity. So for the Pre-Raphaelites, it's looking back at Shakespeare, looking back at the stories of King Arthur. Not exclusively, they're also, as this painting shows, looking at the art of the Italian writer, Dante Alighieri. But there is certainly a sense that the past is a better place and that nations had a better sense of themselves. Nationalism often looks back to the past as opposed to the future. And so, this is their basic ideas here. And you can see the main artists are William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, I should say, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And there was an English art critic named John Ruskin who was a big supporter of these guys. But their sort of doctrine here is to have genuine ideas to express, to study nature attentively, to sympathize with what is direct and serious and heartfelt in previous art, and the exclusion of what is conventional and self-parading, and most indispensable of all, to produce thoroughly good pictures and statues. But there's this desire to sort of create this sort of romanticized view of the past. This is often used as sort of the quintessential pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood painting. This is by John Everett Millais. It is called Ophelia. Ophelia, of course, is a character in William Shakespeare's Hamlet, who is engaged or betrothed to Hamlet, and then Hamlet, after returning back to his home of Elsinore Castle to discover that his father is dead, but also that his mom now has married his uncle, and he feels like the world has gone crazy. He starts acting crazy. And of course, the big mystery of Hamlet is he actually going crazy, or is this an act that he is putting on to sort of get to the bottom of things, and by shaking things up? And we never fully know, and that's why Hamlet is Hamlet. But poor Ophelia is in many ways the one who suffers most from this. She is rejected by Hamlet, a man that she loves and thought that she was going to marry. And it's been argued whether Hamlet spurns her and rejects her and says terrible things about her to get her to leave, because he knows things are about to get dangerous. He's either being really nice, or he's just being a total jackass, and he's being really cruel to her. And once again, there's interpretations about why he's acting the way he's acting. But the effect is that she is so distraught by this that she commits suicide. And so here Millais has created this, let's just be flat out honest here, beautiful image of suicide. I mean, this is a rather gruesome subject, but he's painted it in a way that is almost ethereal, that almost seems like something supernatural is happening, that she's not dying, but she's almost like some Arthurian lady of the lake rising up from the water. There's something mystical almost about this depiction of death. And a lot of pre-Raphaelite art focused on sort of fairy stories and things that were beyond our understanding. It is the opposite of realism, guys, right? Okay. So this nationalism that's growing is inherent also in architecture. And we can see that in the works in London of the Houses of Parliament by the architects Charles Barry and A.W.N. Pugin. The Houses of Parliament burned down in the early 1800s, and this is what was rebuilt along with the Clock Tower Big Ben. Now, these were built in the 1830s, but they look Gothic, don't they? With their lancet windows and their tall spires. The only thing that's missing are the flying buttresses. But this is modern architecture made with modern techniques like iron and steel reinforcements, so you no longer need buttresses or flying buttresses. But besides the lack of those, this is a very medieval, Gothic-looking building. And, if you think about it, these are the Houses of Parliament, the body that makes laws in England. And, you know, it's I think fascinating here that they thought that the most appropriate image or the most appropriate style for this would be the Gothic style, which was associated with the English medieval past, even though Gothic is a French derived art form. But don't tell Barry and Pugin that. They would like it. They would like it. Okay. This sort of look toward the past can be also seen in the New World. This is Richard Upjohn's Trinity Church in New York, a building if you've never been to, you need to go to. And once again, Gothic revival, although lacking the flying buttresses. In France, we see not only Gothic interest, but also a new style called the Beaux-Arts style, the beautiful art style, which revived the Baroque. If you look at this image, this is the Paris Opera House, the very famous grand Paris Opera House, built in the 1870s. That looks more like a building built in the 1670s by Louis XIV, with its references to classical architecture and its sort of exuberant Borromini style kind of undulating facade with its protruding columns and very deep recessive windows here. You know, this is an late 19th century building, not a late 17th century building. But modern architecture, or art of the 19th century, I should say, is not just looking back, it can also be looking forward. This is a building called the Grand, this is not the Grand Pavilion, this is the Crystal Palace by John Paxton. And this is a work that was created for a World's Fair in England. And it was meant to be a temporary building, although it was so loved that it was relocated, but then it burned down a little later. But this image this building is the first building that utilized something called modular architecture and utilized mass-produced architectural elements. This thing was basically made in a factory using new techniques that could of cast iron techniques. Produced on a massive scale, on an industrial scale, and the same way with the glass. This was all produced in a factory and then packed and shipped to the site where it was assembled. So this is the first example of that. So this is very much a reflection of the changing kinds of materials that are now available in architecture and are going to revolutionize architecture moving forward. One of the most influential technological revolutions in a century full of technological revolutions is the invention of photography. The first photographs were taken in the 1820s, but photography does not really become a viable art form until the end of the 1830s. And with the work of guys like Louis-Jacques de Daguerre. Daguerre is not the inventor of the photograph by any means. There's not really an inventor of the photograph. It's a technology that involved a lot of different disciplines, so there's not one person that we can point to and say, this person invented photography. But certainly Daguerre is an important early pioneer as both a photographer and an inventor in the medium. He comes up with a technique called the daguerreotype, or the daguerreotype if you want to unfrench it. And this was a technique that used metal plates to create images. The early photographs are going to be mostly of still lifes because the exposure time, and on a camera, when you take a picture, a shutter opens up. And when the shutter opens up, the film or plate inside the camera, or today digital sensors inside the camera, are exposed to light. And however long that shutter is open is called the exposure time. And today, exposure times are literally fractions of a second. But back in the day, exposure times, in the 1830s, 1840s were, 10 minutes. Or depending on, it could vary depending on the amount of light available. So, things tended to be images, pictures were of things that were still. There are some exceptions. In fact, you're looking at what is arguably the first photograph of a living human being. This guy down here, this is a daguerreotype. This was taken at the Temple Boulevard in Paris in the middle of the day. But it looks like a ghost town because all of the horses and carriages and people are moving too quickly, so you can't see them. The exposure time is too long. However, this guy didn't move and he made history. But what we're seeing here is an important technological innovation. Because now for the first time, we can capture what we see instantaneously or near instantaneously and accurately. And so what this also means is that artists are not going to have the same function in the future as they did in the past. Before the camera, artists were the way we visually recorded the world. But after the camera, we don't need artists to do that anymore. So the role of the artist changes dramatically after the invention of the camera. And this is also why we start to see all these radical innovations in painting. And this will continue through the current period because it is no longer necessary for artists to paint realistically if cameras can do that. The image on the right is a print by Damier, who you all know now, Henri Damier, the realist artist, of a guy named Nadar. Nadar is a pioneer in French photography. He opened the first photographic studio in Paris, and he photographed many famous people. On the left is the romantic artist Eugène Delacroix. But Nadar was this very eccentric character. Not only was he a photographer, he was a balloonist. And he took the first ever aerial photographs of Paris. He was this rather eccentric, kind of larger-than-life character. And, portraits are really some of the first photographs outside of still lifes are portraits. By the time we get to the 1860s, 1850s even, really, cameras the exposure time on cameras are swift enough that you can actually take a picture of a living person and they don't have to sit still for 10 or 20 minutes. They can sit still for a matter of 10 or 20 seconds. And also this means that photography starts to become more ubiquitous. By the 1850s and 60s, certainly photography certainly cameras are still really expensive, and your average person cannot afford a camera. But you could go down to a photographic studio in your town or city, or if you lived in a rural area, you could traveling photographers would come by and you could afford a picture. And this is significant, guys, because now for the first time ever, I'm going to go back. I don't know why I changed that. For the first time ever, anybody can get a picture of themselves, of a loved one, of anything they want, really. And photography democratizes the image. Photography allows everybody to make images. So images and more importantly, our visual history is not just controlled by the wealthy and powerful anymore. Because before photography, the only people who could afford pictures were people who could afford painters. And those were people who had money and power. And that meant that images of people, even images of poor people and working class people, were made by wealthy people or for wealthy people. But now we don't have that. Now we have a democratized image. And anybody can get a picture. Pretty crazy stuff. So this medium is brand new. And with this new medium comes discoveries and innovations and pioneers. One of those pioneers is a woman named Julia Margaret Cameron, who's an English photographer, a wealthy noblewoman who received her first camera as a gift from her daughters on her 40th birthday, and then so fell in love with the medium she converted an old greenhouse into a studio and a shed into a dark room and started taking pictures. She is a mother of a kind of photography we call pictorialism. You see this with in fashion magazines all the time today, but these aren't documentary photographs documenting the real world, but they're fictional scenarios staged for the camera. And Julia Margaret Cameron would dress up her subjects as, you know, like Ophelia from Shakespeare, or Lancelot and Guinevere from the stories of King Arthur, or angels from the Bible. She also took photos of very famous people, like her friend Alfred Lord Tennyson. But a lot of her photographs are these pictorials that are meant to be more like paintings than we would think of a documentary photograph. You also notice that some of these paintings are blurry, and that is intentional, because like most early photographers, she's influenced by painters. There weren't other photographers to be influenced by. And so she would shake the camera to create a blurred effect, to create the look of a brushstroke. But also Julia Margaret Cameron reflects an important change that photography brought, and that is the participation of women. Julia Margaret Cameron and many other early photographers were female, were women photographers. And the reason why photography is the first real medium from the get-go to have women who held equal status as men did in the medium is because photography was brand new and there were no rules. If you could afford the equipment and get hold of it and start taking pictures, then you were a photographer. There weren't the sorts of art academies and schools and government regulations overseeing photography that as there was for painting and other art forms, visual art forms. So photography not only democratizes the image and gives anybody the ability to take pictures or to own pictures or to have pictures of themselves taken, but it also gives women an equal voice in photography. And so this is a medium that from the get-go, it's not just like, oh, here's, you know, this random woman artist we're throwing in who's one out of every 500 artists or so is a woman. No, it's like 50% of the pioneering women art or the pioneering photographers are women. All right. Of course, in the United States, we see photography really take off, and especially with that, the work of Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady is a photographer who asked Congress if he could photograph the Civil War. Now, the Civil War, the American Civil War, was not the first war ever photographed, but it was the first war photographed extensively. Matthew Brady and other photographers working under him, like Timothy O'Sullivan, took numerous pictures of not just soldiers in the battlefield, but officers and equipment and weapons and horses. And I mean, it's an almost fully documented war. It's the first fully documented war. And photography gave us something else we had never had access to before, which is historical events, visual representations of historical events as they happened. Before photography, if you wanted to see a picture of a historical event, well, an artist had to paint it. And these paintings were often made days, weeks, months, sometimes years after the fact. And with the artist usually not having been a witness to that historical event. But with photography now, we could see things as they happened, right after they happened, in all their sort of gruesome documentary detail. This is a game changer. Photography literally changes the way we see the world. It changes the way who had access to images and the stories we could tell. It also changed the way we remember things. Because if you think about it, we remember things because of photographs. I can remember events from my childhood, from when I'm 2 and 3 years old. Not from my own memory, but from my memory of seeing pictures of those moments. And I have access to other people's memories, people who are long dead. I have memories of events like this one you see in front of you, events that happened a century and a half before, or century before I was born almost. And yet I can see them and I can experience them in a way, thanks to this incredible new technology. Edward Muybridge is kind of the missing link between photography and film. And I'm going to have you guys watch a short documentary about Muybridge down below. Okay, so that wraps up the chapter on neoclassicism, romanticism, and realism. It's been quite the journey, guys. I'll see you next time.